The Pilgrims. At Thanksgiving time, when you hear the word pilgrims, many Americans immediately think in their minds of somebody like this. They see the Pilgrims as a group of people who basically wore black and white clothes with a funny back buckle hat and funny buckle shoes. But even that visualization of the Pilgrims is not correct. They did not dress like that. In fact, they dressed in some very bold colors. They were very typical of the people of their day. The Pilgrims are a Protestant religious group. They wanted to separate from the Church of England. Many years before the Pilgrims, there was a king in England called Henry VIII, who's best known for having many wives. However, the first wife he had, who happened to be the daughter of Isabella of Spain, the same Ferdinand and Isabella who sent Columbus on their way, the king had married her at a young age, and a few years later he wanted a divorce. But that time, basically everybody in Europe was a Roman Catholic, and the only way to get a divorce was if the Pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, granted you one himself. So the king was very hopeful because, hey, he was the king of England, that the Pope would grant him divorce. Instead, the Pope did not grant him a divorce. And in response, Henry VIII decides to take away England from the Catholic Church. He decides to start a new church in England called the Church of England. And who better to head this Church of England than himself, the king? So now, with Henry VIII establishing a new church, it's still a Christian church, but it's not a Catholic church. They're basically protesting against the Catholic, they're Protestants. But now, with a new church, you have to have a new head. And who better to be your new head than, well, the king? And once the king becomes the head of the Church of England, he grants himself a divorce so he can marry somebody else. After that point, the English regarded their sort of Church of England as sort of superior to the Catholic Church. But basically, it was almost the same. There were very few differences. Some English people wanted to take the Church of England even further away from the Catholic Church. They wanted to, for example, simplify the music and simplify the dress. And instead of having the preacher sort of preach from a platform and be almost, it seemed, above you, they basically wanted him to be one of you on an equal level. They wanted basically a Bible for everyone, not just one Bible in the church. So there were many differences that the Pilgrims wanted to implement in the Church of England to make it, they thought, even better. So eventually, the Pilgrims began to believe that there was no hope for changing the Church of England. You could only separate from it and make your own church. So the Pilgrims became separatist. They wanted to separate from the Church of England and create their own church. Unfortunately, that created problems for the Pilgrims because that really irritated the king. Obviously, if you don't like the Church of England, you don't like the leader, the King of England. And even more so, if you were successful at changing the Church of England so it wouldn't need the king as the head of the Church of England, how long would it be before people in England figured out you didn't need a king of England at all? So the king was not very happy with the group we call the Pilgrims. He had them beat up on the street. He had them thrown in jail for no reason. He had them fired for their jobs. That is, they were persecuted for their religious beliefs. So the Pilgrims, who were basically somewhat poor English people, there were never many of them, and they were somewhat poor, they believed their only chance was to leave England. And where did they go? Well, not to America. Are you crazy? America was a wilderness. It was a death trap. The people of Jamestown certainly proved that. They were dying by the hundreds at Jamestown. Apparently, no one in their right mind would actually go to America. No, instead, the Pilgrims turned to another civilized area in Europe called the Netherlands, sometimes called Holland. And there the Pilgrims departed England, arrived in the Netherlands, where they found full religious freedom. And for 11 years, they stayed in the Netherlands, starting and creating their own church and practicing the way they wanted. One of the only problems, however, was that over time, the Pilgrim parents started to notice something about their Pilgrim children living in the Netherlands. They started realizing or started listening to their children speak, and the children were using some very strange words, which the Pilgrim parents certainly did not approve of. And the Pilgrim children were starting to dress in clothes the Pilgrim parents really didn't approve of. And the Pilgrim parents were starting to hear that their kids, their children were listening to strange music and started singing music that they really didn't approve of. Of course, we are talking about the Pilgrim parents and not our parents. But of course, what was happening was the Pilgrim children from England were becoming Dutch. They were listening to Dutch music, beginning to speak Dutch, dressing like the Dutch. But for the Pilgrims, certainly their religion was important, but so was being English. It seems strange in today's terms that at that time in history, different nations sort of thought they were superior to other nations. And people in those nations were proud of who they were and were happy they weren't somebody else. So people in England tended to think that their English society was better than other countries in Europe, and the Pilgrim parents certainly thought so. So they certainly did not want their children to become Dutch. So what did the Pilgrims' parents do? Well, naturally, they decided to move their kids 3,500 miles away to a wilderness where they could die. They decided to move to America. So sometimes we, as we grow up, we think our parents are maybe a little harsh on us, but let us thank our parents, because I don't think any of them have moved us 3,500 miles away to a wilderness where we could die simply because we weren't using the correct language and dressing correctly, unlike the Pilgrim parents. Of course, to move that far, the Pilgrims would have to have the king's permission. And one might think the king would say no. After all, he didn't like the Pilgrims. But actually, the king said yes. He was a smart guy. He realized it's a win-win situation for him as the king. Let us say the Pilgrims went to what they knew now as America, and they started a colony, and the colony was successful. Well, first of all, the king wouldn't have to hear or see the Puritans in his own country. Plus the fact that the Pilgrims became successful in America, the king could tax them. He could make money off of his enemies. On the other hand, let's say the Pilgrims went to America and all died. In that case, the king was a winner again. So the king approved their journey. So after 11 years of living in Holland, they started drifting back to England, where they purchased 2 ships, the Speedwell and the Mayflower. And in 1606, loading up those 2 ships, they left Plymouth Harbor to sail to America. Sadly, the Speedwell did not speed well. She sank well. So the Pilgrims had to go back to the harbor, fix up the Speedwell, and again, both ships left the harbor. But the Speedwell was not even out of the harbor before she started taking on water and sinking again. So the Pilgrims would have to leave the Speedwell there and take only the Mayflower. Some of the Pilgrims would have to stay perhaps for the next ship, for the next journey. Meanwhile, about 102 passengers loaded up on the Mayflower and started to sail to the New World. Their journey was to take them to Virginia, to the area just north of Jamestown. The king had been very specific. He wanted them just to the north of Jamestown because the people of Jamestown were loyal to the king. The people of Jamestown were Church of England members. The king knew they would spy on the Pilgrims. And if the Pilgrims were successful, then he could send some tax collectors from Jamestown to collect taxes from the Pilgrims. And if the Pilgrims died, then the king would quickly find out, and he could probably throw a party back home. But on their journey, as they approached America, a terrible storm came up, and the Pilgrim ship, the Mayflower, was blown hundreds and hundreds of miles off course to the north. So by the time they arrived in America, they were nowhere near Jamestown. They were 500 plus miles to the north, where people of Jamestown could not spy on them. What a lucky coincidence! Or was it? So America's first conspiracy theory is that the Pilgrims bribed the ship's captain to take them off course so that they would be free of spies from Jamestown. Whatever the case, the Mayflower arrived. Yay. In 1620. But as they approached the coast, some on the Mayflower were panicked. They were fearful. Not everyone on the Mayflower was actually a pilgrim. The Pilgrims tended to be poor farmers, so they lacked some skills to build, for example, houses. So they had brought some skilled workmen with them. The only thing is, the skilled workmen were Church of England members. And now, being outside sort of the king's protection, so to speak, the skilled workmen were afraid that when they went to shore, the Pilgrims would just boss them around, would take away their freedom of worship, would make them worship like the Pilgrims did. The skilled workmen refused to get off the ship. In order to get everyone off, the Pilgrims decided on a compromise. They decided to write a document, because they were so far away from where the king told them they could land, that would basically reiterate, re-say that English laws applied. That they would create, in their terms, a civil body politic, a group of people. That is, they would elect their leaders. This has come known to us as the Mayflower Compact, which was one of the first attempts at self-government in the New World. Just 1 year before Jamestown, in 1619, the House of Burgesses had begun, where people in and around Jamestown could elect representatives to go make the laws for them. And now the Pilgrims were basically doing the same thing before they got off the ship. Of course, people in England were just sort of expected to do this because, again, the English king was not like a European king. He was not an absolute ruler. The king had not been an absolute ruler since 1215, since the Magna Carta, since the rich people in England had basically made the king create a group of people, an advisory board called Parliament, to help the king run the country. So people in England were used to having groups of people voting. So no wonder once they got here, they wanted to vote. Once the Mayflower Compact was signed, everyone agreed that they would get off the ship. The first place they got off the ship was a place called Provincetown, because they believed it was God's providence that they had arrived, that they had been have a safe voyage. But after scouting the area, they found that it was not a very good area for growing crops. Instead, as they scouted around, they found a little harbor, and they pulled the Mayflower in. They noticed this harbor had cleared fields around it. And so they offloaded their ship onto this land. Unfortunately, by the time they arrived in 1620, it was getting near winter time, and they had to hastily build a house to try to house all of the people. and the winter itself was somewhat severe. And by the next spring, one half of the pilgrims had died. On the other hand, the journey to Plymouth does provide us with some interesting parables, stories. Some may be true, some may be false. But the first story is that the pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. That when they arrived, they pulled in, there was this big rock. And that's where the pilgrims stepped off. Well, maybe so, maybe not. Eventually, that rock at Plymouth, and you can see it, by the way, if you're ever in Plymouth, as you're driving along the street to see the replica of the Mayflower, which they have. Off the right-hand side of the road is this little, it almost looks like a Roman architectural structure, but it's not. Because once you enter this structure, you look down and you see, there's Plymouth Rock. And of course, for many of us who've heard the story of Plymouth Rock, we'd expect it to be really, really big. But apparently it wasn't that big. In fact, it had been bigger. But then after the pilgrims landed and got started with their colony, they decided to drag the rock into town. Probably to make it like a tourist attraction. But along the way, the rock splits in half. So they leave one half the rock on the beach and they take the other half the rock into town. In town, a few years later, the rock splits again in two. Now, eventually, they decide to take what's the rock in town and glue it to the rock still on the beach, except by this time they've lost the other half of the rock that's in town. So they bring the quarter of a rock back to the main Plymouth Rock that was on the beach and basically sort of stick it back together. At any rate, it's a cute little story. Don't really know if they actually landed there or not. Wasn't there to see it. What I do know is the place where they landed was already cleared. And that's because it had been an Indian village. But apparently the Indians had left. The pilgrims called this village Plymouth. And in the spring, they started planting their crops. As they did, out from the forest, an Indian emerges and says, "Greetings, Englishmen." And he says it in English. It appears that English fishermen had been going up and down the coast of America for several years before the pilgrims actually arrived, and this sort of minor chief that the Indians had in the area had learned English from the fishermen. Now, the minor chief, Samoset, then returned with another Indian, Squanto. And Squanto and Samoset helped the English plant crops and showed them how to fertilize and where the best places to plant the crops were. So they were helpful for the pilgrims. Samoset spoke some English words. Squanto spoke perfect English because Squanto had learned English in England. It turns out that when Squanto was a mere lad, a boy, he and his friends had been off on the beach by his village of Powtex. As they played, an English fishing ship came up, expecting that they might get some nice trinkets, some nice toys. Apparently, the lads ran out to the boats, and Squanto was actually taken by the English. And he was taken back to England, basically to be a slave. It was there that he was sold to a very rich Englishman who used him as a house servant, basically as a butler, And so for the next several years, Squanto lived in England, learning English, living among rich English people. Then in 1614, the rich Englishman has no use for Squanto anymore and says, "Oh, you're free, you can go home now." So Squanto catches the first ship going to America. Unfortunately, that ship goes way far into Newfoundland, where the Vikings had landed many years, hundreds and hundreds of years earlier. Far, far too far to walk to his village of Pautex. So Squanto had to go back with the English on that same ship and back to England. Eventually, he's able to get another ship, and he agrees to work as a crew member on that ship, and he goes to the Americas, and he's dropped off a few miles from his village. He starts walking to his village when another ship pulls up. This is a Spanish ship. He's kidnapped again. He's taken to Spain to made as a slave. This time he escapes, and some local priest hide him out for several years, eventually smuggle him to England, where he gets another ship. This time the ship again goes back to the Americas, near the village of Pautex. Squanto gets out of the ship, starts walking to Pautex, and when he gets there, he finds his village is still there. He looks and he sees that there are people still there, but as he approaches, he realizes these people aren't his people, they're English people. The village of Pautex had become the village of Plymouth. Just 2 years before the Pilgrims had arrived, a plague had swept up and down the coast of New England. It had killed approximately 90 to 95% of all the Indians. As the Indians had developed, as the Native Americans had developed in the New World, remember they had been cut off from all the other parts of the world for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so they had not seen or experienced some of these other diseases that were in the world. So when English fishermen came up the coast, apparently the English fishermen had unknowingly passed some of their diseases to the Indians, and it spread very quickly, and large numbers of Indians died because of this disease. 95% it's estimated. In the village of Pautex, 100% of the people died. So by the time Squanto gets back, everyone he had known was dead. Squanto then found some other local Indians, the Wampanoag, and threw his lot in with them. They're commanded by Chief Mazzoset. And so in that spring of 1621, when Squanto appears in the village of Plymouth, it is his village. It is his home. So he's eager to help the people that are there. As the crops go in, the Pilgrims then invite the local Wampanoag Indians to celebrate with them. The Pilgrims, of course, are celebrating their survival, but they're also celebrating the harvest. Their crops have grown and grown well. By this time, there's, again, only about 55 or 60 Englishmen still alive. Resupply ships have not yet arrived in Plymouth. And about 90 warriors from the Wampanoag tribe also attend. So the English and the natives sit down together to have a feast, to play games. The Pilgrims, being very religious, of course, give praise to God before they eat. But then basically for 3 days, they play game, they eat. We know there were wild turkeys in the area, although no one actually mentions that in a letter as something they ate. We do know they ate deer. We do know they ate fish and shellfish and cabbage and carrots and pumpkins. Of course, all that's Indian food. All of that's North American food. All of that is native to North America. So the Indians were well used to this food. The Pilgrims, of course, were enjoying it almost for the first time. And so this sort of cements the alliance between the Wampanoag tribe and the Pilgrims. It's important to note that the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims did not exactly love each other, but they needed each other. Certainly the Pilgrims needed the Wampanoags as friends in this very hostile land, but the Wampanoags needed the Pilgrims. Before the plague, the Wampanoags probably could have fielded an army of several thousand warriors. After the plague, they were fielding an army of 90 men. The Wampanoags were somewhat fearful that other Indian tribes would quickly move into the area and take them over. But the Pilgrims had guns and cannons. And so the Wampanoags apparently recognized that it might be nice to have some friends with some firepower. In the very same way that the Pilgrims recognized it might be nice to have some friends that knew the local area and could help with food supply. And so the first Thanksgiving, well, more or less. 1621. Now, the next year they didn't have a Thanksgiving. The year after that they did. So this Thanksgiving tradition continued on and off for several years, for many years. But our Thanksgiving actually comes thanks to Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, where he proclaims a day of Thanksgiving in November to celebrate United States Army victories. But again, this Thanksgiving is somewhat important because it does show that the English and the native tribes can work together, can at least not kill each other, at least for a time. So it served as a future model for Thanksgiving. Sort of show people what Thanksgiving should be, that you shouldn't just include your own kind, but that you should invite other types of people. So even today, Americans like to sit down for Thanksgiving and invite friends besides just family. It showed that Indians and Europeans could get together and work along each other. It showed the Pilgrims could survive and build a long-lasting colony. And because the Pilgrims survived, and because Jamestown survived, that means other Englishmen were now willing to make the trip to America to start more colonies. On the other hand, again, it's not why we celebrate Thanksgiving today. Again, that comes from us in the 1860s with Abraham Lincoln. It wasn't celebrated every year by the Pilgrims. It was on and off. The good relations with Indians were somewhat short-lived. And the Pilgrim colony was always small. It never got over maybe 7,000 people at maximum, because there were always a small number of Pilgrims in England. And so, even though many made the trip over, there were never going to be a lot of Pilgrims. And again, as far as the first Thanksgiving, well, you can decide for yourself, because the first Thanksgiving in the United States, we have to remember that there were already Europeans in what we now know as the United States before the English arrived, the Spanish. And in 1541, Coronado, who was out looking for gold and was lost in the Paladero Canyon area in Texas, eventually some local Indians found him. The Spanish called these the Tejas Indians, the friendly Indians. And as the Indians rescued Coronado and gave them food and water, so Coronado and his men would not die, Coronado had a priest with him, and he offered up a mass, a religious service at Thanksgiving, although apparently no natives were invited at that time. But if that doesn't qualify as the first Thanksgiving in America, try 1565, St. Augustine, Florida. 800 Spaniards arrive, about half of them, who had left Spain, that is, half of them died on the voyage over. 800 Spaniards arrived to build this new colony. And as they were building it, they worked with the local natives. We also know that besides the Spanish, they had brought over some Africans, some free Africans, some slave Africans. So they all celebrated that Thanksgiving, that is that successful ocean voyage and the starting of St. Augustine, Florida, with a feast with the local Indians. Probably not your typical Thanksgiving meal because they had salted pork and beans, which the Spanish brought with them. I don't really think salted pork is on many people's Thanksgiving Day menu. And if that doesn't qualify as the first Thanksgiving, try 1598. A Spaniard named Moneda was leading a Spanish expedition of 500 men, women, and children to lands he had been given, but they were lost. The Spanish tended to get lost. America was a very large place, and in parts the landscape for hundreds of miles looked very similar. But they were found by the local natives near the Rio Grande River and were led to what is now El Paso, Texas. The Spanish offered a massive Thanksgiving, that is, they had a religious ceremony, and then they went off shooting wild game, and the Indians went off fishing, and they brought their food together and had a feast. Interesting enough, the Spanish performed the first drama production that we know of that is in what is now the United States of America. So as the Europeans arrive, they're thankful just for surviving. And sometimes they're thankful alone, and sometimes they're thankful that they have native allies that have helped them out. But the Pilgrims, a group of separatists who have changed history, who risked their lives to arrive for a better way of life, for a better way of life for their children, for religious freedoms, and their story will be followed by other Europeans because, again, they were successful.